What on earth is happening? As my nephew and I stand dumbfounded on the sandy beach, the cruiser carrying my husband callously sails away, leaving us stranded on this deserted island. We were here for a family trip. Supposed to enjoy camping. I had planned to create some beautiful memories for my adorable nephew. Now, left to behold this unbelievable scene, I could only stand frozen, powerless. My name is Nancy. I'm 37 years old and live with my husband, whom I've been married to for a few years now. We don't have any kids yet. Before getting married, it was just my younger sister, Emily, and me. Our parents, who were my everything, passed away simultaneously in March, just as I was about to graduate from high school. They were killed in a sudden car accident. At that time, Emily was only a 14-year-old middle school student. I wanted to do whatever I could to send Emily to college, so I started working immediately after my high school graduation. Emily studied hard, making use of every available moment, and using scholarships, she successfully graduated from college. Afterwards, Emily found a job, married a man she met in college. And drawing on her work experience, she and her husband started a business which turned out to be a great success. When Emily came to announce her engagement, she looked apologetic, saying, "I am getting married and becoming happy thanks to you, while you have not yet, but none of that mattered to me." I was just overjoyed to see my beloved sister finding someone she loved and intending to live a happy life with him. 2 years later, my nephew, named Scott, was born. Seeing Emily, surrounded by her new family and smiling happily, was all the satisfaction I needed. I met my current husband, David, a little while after Scott was born. We were introduced through a mutual friend. From the stories David told me when we started dating, I gathered that he didn't have a good relationship with his parents. They didn't support his wish to go to college. So he used student loans to attend, and is still repaying them. Both David and I come from complicated family backgrounds and have struggled with money for a long time. I think these shared experiences were what brought us together. I accepted David's proposal without hesitation. Since most of his earnings go towards repaying his student loan, I'm the one who contributes more to our household expenses. But I have no complaints about that. Rather, as two people who have faced hardships, we want to support each other and live our lives together. I have only met David's parents once, during our pre-wedding introductions, and haven't seen them since. I remember an awkward atmosphere hanging in the air at that meeting. Even though we can't afford luxuries, I felt a modest sense of happiness in our life. But then, a shocking incident occurred. I received a sudden call from the police, informing me that Emily and her husband were involved in a car accident. Emily and her husband passed away suddenly, leaving only Scott behind. Stunned, I left work early and hurried to the hospital where their bodies were kept. There, in front of the mortuary, sat a boy on a bench all alone. It was Scott, Emily's only son. There was nobody with him, he wasn't crying, and he just sat there looking anxious. Seeing Scott like that, I couldn't help but hold him tight. And I decided then and there that I would not let this boy be alone, that I would make him happy in place of my sister and her husband. When I brought Scott home, my husband didn't bother to hide his sour face. I had pleaded with David, who was cold towards Scott, many times, "Please stop behaving like that." At some point, he seemed to have developed affection for his nephew, and one day, out of the blue, he agreed to live together. He's Nancy's beloved sister's child. We need to make him happy. While I found it puzzling that David could so suddenly change his mind, I took advantage of his change of heart and proceeded with the adoption. Scott would often show me his smile and seemed to bond well with me, but with David, he always seemed a bit distant. David's initial attitude towards Scott was very cold, and above all, Scott had just lost his biological parents. Until Scott calmed down, I decided to let things happen naturally, without pushing him. Additionally, Emily and her husband had left a considerable amount of inheritance for Scott. However, I decided it would be best to let Scott decide what to do with the money when he gets older, and until then, I decided not to touch it. Without David knowing, I prepared a safety deposit box and stored all documents related to the bank book, checks, and inheritance. By the way, Scott would sometimes stare blankly into the distance. There were also times when he appeared to be listening to something while staring at nothing. I had some idea about this. Emily once said, Scott seems to be able to see and hear things we can't. However, I found it hard to believe at the time and brushed it off. This went on for a few months. Then, David suggested that we take a trip. I'm thinking of going to a campground on an isolated island by cruiser. They have all the facilities there. That sounds fun. But isn't the cruise expensive? You don't need to worry about that. A friend of mine was supposed to go, but something came up and he gave it to us at a very cheap price. Seeing David so happy, I slowly warmed up to the idea. I thought it would be a great opportunity for Scott. I hoped that cruising and camping would help change his mood. Well, let's get ready then. As David cheerily left the room, Scott watched him go with a surprisingly cold gaze. Scott, what's wrong? Aunt Nancy, there's something I want to tell you, but we have to keep it a secret from Uncle David. With that, Scott showed me something that looked like a voice recorder. And the conversation that played from it left me stunned. On the day of the trip, the cruiser carrying us left the harbor early in the morning. When we arrived at the island, David was the first to disembark and helped Scott and me off the cruiser. Nancy, watch your step there. Oh, thank you. Scott, be careful not to trip, okay? Yeah. Seeing David in such a good mood, I was both bewildered and happy. After all, it was our first family trip together. I wanted to make many wonderful memories for Scott. David, I'll unload the camping gear from the boat. You two go ahead and find a good place to pitch the tent. Okay. Holding hands with Scott, I walked away from the ship. Once he saw us leave, David went back to the ship and began talking to the cruiser driver. And then... What? Unbelievably, my husband didn't disembark from the cruiser. Instead, he left Scott and me on the island, and the cruiser began to speed off into the open sea. In no time at all, the ship had disappeared from sight. What on earth is happening? I was completely at a loss for what was happening and mumbled these words to myself. Nancy, it's okay, Scott said. But... Mom said someone would come soon. Mom? Emily? Emily said that? Scott nodded emphatically. It reminded me of something Emily once told me. Scott seems to have some kind of mysterious power. He can see auras of good and evil in people and things, and recently, he seems to be able to predict the near future, albeit vaguely. Predictions about the near future like a package will arrive soon, or someone will come around the next corner. The details of these predictions are often vague, but they pertain to the near future. When Emily told me this, I didn't really believe her. Surely not, I thought. Yet, in this situation, I clung to Scott's words. With a surge of hope from Scott's words, I decided to first protect myself from the heat of this midsummer day and moved to a shaded area where there was a breeze. I conserved energy by moving as little as possible. Luckily, we had a flask of tea in Scott's backpack, and we shared it. Scott, are you okay? You don't feel sick or anything, do you? I'm fine. What? Nancy, look! They're coming! In the direction Scott was pointing, I could see a small motorboat approaching. It seemed to be manned by 3 teenage boys. They looked extremely surprised to see us camping with only one bag. Of course they were. Apparently, they were having fun fishing in their parents' motorboat and visited various fishing spots. Fortunately, the deserted island we were on was one of the spots they frequently visited. Of course, the island is privately owned campsite and off-limits to anyone not involved. Thanks to their secret fishing game, our lives were saved. The boys let us ride in their motorboat, and Scott and I were able to return safely to the mainland. After saying goodbye to the boys, Scott pulled out a GPS from his backpack to show me. Is that a GPS? I didn't need to call for help because I was told someone would come soon. Emily really said that. I was confused by what was happening before me. The fact that I was abandoned by my husband. Scott, who claimed to hear Emily's voice, even though she was supposed to be gone. Scott's preparedness. As my mind was in a whirl, my phone suddenly rang. This number. Hello? As the story on the other end of the phone unfolded, my head, initially in turmoil, began to cool bit by bit. Yes, I understand. My body couldn't stop shaking with anger. I can't believe he would stoop so low. I absolutely won't forgive him. After what he's done to Scott and me. An eye for an eye. No, we'll give him triple what he gave us. After that, I made a call to certain people, explaining the situation. The next day. Phew, I'm beat. You're late, aren't you? What, Nancy? How are you here? My husband returned home leisurely, unaware that we had beaten him to it. The call that had come in when Scott and I landed was a report from the detective agency I had hired before our trip. The day my husband invited us on the trip, the voice recorder that Scott had shared with me had captured my husband discussing financial matters with someone. Nancy, I feel like he is up to no good. I was surprised that Scott even had a voice recorder, but what my husband was discussing was even more shocking. With a bad premonition, I decided to look into our joint savings account. And there was barely anything left. My husband had withdrawn the money without my knowledge. Shocked, I wanted to confront my husband right away. But I suppressed that urge, thinking it was best to first get solid evidence, so I decided to hire a detective agency. It was during the cruise trip before this report arrived that Scott and I nearly faced danger. After receiving the report from the detective agency, I immediately contacted my husband's parents to explain and confirm the course of the incident and the contents of the report. Upon hearing my story, my in-laws said, "We'd like to be present when you talk to David," and immediately made their way over here. That's how we got to this point. And there was another man present whom I had contacted. "Why are my parents here?" "So, you reported that Scott and I went missing, that we fell from the cruiser? How thoughtful of you." That's. But we didn't fall from the cruiser, you left us on the island." My husband was pale and drenched in cold sweat, trying to think of some excuse. In addition to this incident, it seemed like my in-laws had something they wanted to confirm with my husband. According to the report from the detective agency and my in-laws, my husband had not been repaying his student loans at all. The truth was that he had a massive debt from gambling in his college days, and had asked his parents to cover the repayments on the condition of monthly payments. The reason he had been telling me he was estranged from his parents was entirely due to this debt, and he had cut off visits to his family so I wouldn't notice the delays in repayment. Moreover, for about the last year, those repayments had been delayed. And there was another reason for that. My husband was smitten with a certain club girl, and was splurging on her as if money was water. Because of this, he was not only unable to make repayments to his family, but he also spent our savings. What the hell is going on? Will you explain it now? Surrounded from all sides and with no way out, my husband finally gave in and began to talk. She had a gangster boyfriend. Apparently, the girl and her gangster boyfriend had repeatedly demanded hush money to keep their affair secret from me and our parent company. In other words, he had been trapped in a scam, played like a sucker. At first, he was paying out of his own salary, then moved on to our savings. According to him, when he was running out of money and panicking, I happened to mention wanting to take care of Scott. Initially, he thought it would be impossible to take on another child when they were so strapped for cash. However, when he found out the child was the son of my sister and brother-in-law, who had been running a business, he thought he might be able to make use of their wealth. But no matter how much I searched, I couldn't find the passbook containing the inheritance. I thought if Scott, the supposed inheritor of the inheritance, and his guardian, Nancy, disappeared, the property would become mine. His selfish reasoning left both me and his parents flabbergasted. Despite this, David insisted that he was a victim. "I was constantly extorted by gangsters. I'm a victim too, right? Right?" Another person present at the scene quietly said to him. "Enough is enough." His quiet but powerful words filled with anger silenced David, who had been shouting until now. "First of all, there's no way such selfish reasoning would work. And there's no reason why you, who has nothing to do with this, should say such things to me. This is Mr. Stevens, a lawyer." Lawyer. Mr. Stevens was a close friend of Emily's husband. Since Scott was born, Mr. Stevens seemed to have adored him very much. Even after Emily and her husband died in an accident, he seemed to be very concerned about what happened to Scott. And when it was decided that Scott would be taken in by me, it turned out that he had provided him with a GPS and a voice recorder. "Scott, we don't know what's gonna happen from here on out. So, I'll give you this," he said. "What is this?" Scott asked. "If you feel like something bad is about to happen, use this recorder to keep some evidence. The GPS here is set up so that if you press this button, it'll tell me your location on my phone." I understand. Scott, listen well. If anything happens, don't hesitate to call on me. It was thanks to Mr. Stevens that Scott could record suspicious conversations of my husband and have the means to call for help using the GPS, if necessary. And that ended up saving not only Scott but me as well. Scott is very important to me. I'll never forgive you for putting him in danger. My husband, unable to respond, just fell to his knees. Without any will to resist left, my husband was taken away by the police officers that Mr. Stevens had called. Later it turned out, the driver of the yacht was a gambling buddy of my husband's. He had apparently persuaded his friend that if the plan went well, they would make a lot of money, and got him involved in this scheme. The man was also sentenced to heavy punishment for his involvement in this murder and several other crimes. As for the girl who triggered this whole commotion and her gangster boyfriend, they were already on the police radar as habitual con artists. My husband's arrest led to their arrests as well, Mr. Stevens told me later. After my husband was arrested, I immediately filed for divorce. And so, I started living alone with Scott. Raising a boy was challenging and I often felt lost, but with the help of those around me, I managed to make it work. As for Scott's mysterious powers that greatly helped solve this case, it seemed to gradually disappear as he grew up. He doesn't hear voices of invisible people or see auras anymore, Scott tells me with a smile. Although I feel a twinge of sadness about it, seeing Scott smiling happily brings me great contentment. Mr. Stevens, who adored Scott, seemed very worried at first about me managing the inheritance as Scott's guardian. Aunt Nancy is fine, Scott assured him. Really? Why do you say that? Because Mom said so. She said she would definitely protect me, Scott replied with a grin. It seems he took Scott's words to heart. Before long, Scott started to beg to go out and play with just the three of us. Now, Scott watches with a happy, slightly mischievous face as Mr. Stevens, who has now completely warmed up to me, and I talk. Whenever I asked, "Why are you looking at me like that?" Scott would dodge the question with, "It's nothing." And at those times, Mr. Stevens would invariably let out an awkward, strained laugh. After several such exchanges, one day Mr. Stevens proposed to me, mentioning the prospect of marriage. Shocked, I asked Scott, "Did you know this was going to happen?" To which he replied with his usual evasive smile, "Who knows?"